Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with not your average model showcase video. This video here is going to be more or less a how-to step-by-step tutorial video on how to build and paint one of these World War Toons M26 Pershing tank kits. I'm also pretty sure that some individuals watching this video might be getting a sense of deja vu because this is not the first time one of these World War Toons M26 Pershings was sitting on this table. About a year ago, I built this exact same kit and built it to almost identical specs to the one that you see it here. That video is found on the ECA channel, and it's basically your standard garden variety ECA model showcase video. Well, after that video was filmed, the model was put into the collection, and it just sat there ever since. However, a month or so ago, a viewer out there saw the video. They liked the model so much that they went ahead and contacted me to see if I would build one of these models in exact same configuration for commission. The model that you see here was built for commission and belongs to that private collector. More specifically, that collector's son, as this model here was being built as a gift. Along with this model here, I have another one of these World War Toons builds that I also built for the same individual, and that video should be posted around the same time this video drops, so you might want to check the channel out to see that video as well. As I frequently state in these videos, I often take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35 scale and 1/6 scale. Although this model here is neither of those scales, it is something that I can take on for a commission build from time to time, and if you're interested in pricing and availability information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@EastCoastArmory.com. This model here is built mostly out of the box. However, just like with my other World War Toons M26 Pershing build, I went ahead and made some modifications to various aspects of this kit. Since I've already done a standard model showcase video on this exact same kit here, for this video, I'm going to be doing something a little bit different. Rather than just having the model already completed and just pointing out several of the things that I've done, with this video, we're actually going to start at the beginning of the project, and I'm going to take you through the entire build from start to finish. So stay tuned because there's going to be a lot of info coming right at you. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this Meng cartoon scale M26 Pershing kit from their World War Toons lineup. Now, for anyone who's a frequent viewer of the channel, this here should look very familiar because about a year ago on the last April Fool's Day video, I went ahead and built this exact same kit and did a thorough kit review of that build as well. However, in a quick nutshell, the World War Toons lineup, it consists of vehicles from the online video game World War Toons. It's made by the model company Meng, who's generally known for producing some very high quality super kits in 1/35 scale. The models themselves are made entirely of injection molded polystyrene with the exception of the tracks, which are single piece vinyl. The kits are known to be very easy to put together and once assembled have a very interesting look that gives you the look and feel of the real vehicle in question, but have these weird wonky proportions on them that make for an interesting display piece. Their Pershing is kit number 10 and is a relatively recent release. I believe it came out about a year, maybe 2 years ago at this point. However, these models here are still fairly easily come by on places like Amazon as well as on eBay. Not to mention you might snag one or two in your local hobby shop. Well, enough with that. Let's go ahead and crack the box open. All of the World War Toons kits are side opening, which is something you don't really generally see on most model kits these days. And everything is self-contained in this little bag that we have here. Like I said before, everything is made from injection molded polystyrene, and on this model here, it is this olive greeny type color that we see found on the plastic parts. Opening the bag, I can now dump out the contents. Like I said, everything is mostly simplistic with their overall shape, but you do have the look and feel of the vehicle in question. Now, from building the Pershing the last time, I can say that this model does go together very easily. Some of the earlier World War Toons models tend to be a little bit more trickier to put together compared to some of the more recent releases, but having said that, all these builds go together pretty well, I found. Probably one of the more interesting aspects, however, to point out for their Pershing kit involves the suspension and how that connects to the upper hull. Namely, if we notice, we have the side skirts integrally molded to the side of the tank. This can cause issues when it comes time for installing the tracks, which is why if you follow the instructions, they basically want you to assemble fully the suspension prior to the upper hull getting mounted on. The way I do my builds, I tend to have the upper and lower connected as one piece because this allows me to delete any sort of seam work that may remain, and then I typically add the suspension at the very tail end of the build, just before the model is fully completed. With the M26 Pershing, it is a little bit trickier, however, even with that format, because if you note, we have all of these studs that emerge from the side hull over here. So when it comes time for mounting on the track, this tends to add a little bit of a complication to it, but it's one that can still be done, but you do have to be very careful with it. Also, one other thing I want to point out with the Pershing before I dig into this build is one modification I am going to make involves the sprocket. You see, here we have the sprockets halves right here. We have this one with this inner portion that descends in, and then we have this one here that would be on the face of it. The funny thing is, on the real M26 Pershing, this would be what the sprocket would look like if you look at it from the outside, because it has a sunken hub, much along the lines as you would find on the Sherman with the HVSS suspension. This was something I addressed on my last M26 Pershing build, where I mounted the sprockets technically inaccurate because they were backwards by having this dished-in portion being exposed. This does, in my opinion, improve the look of the model, making it look a little bit more accurate compared to the stock kit, but then again, keep in mind, accuracy isn't something that is too much of a concern on one of these builds, but it does improve the look, I find. Now, in order to do this, you do have to make some slight modifications to the hull itself, because with the way the hull is designed, of course, they want you to mount the sprockets on their way, which need to connect to these two shanks here. If you want to install the pieces with the sprockets on backwards, you are going to have to make some mods to these two portions here that I will discuss as I dig into this build. So, well, with that out of the way, let's go ahead and start with the construction. To start this build, I'm going to briefly touch upon the tools I'm going to use. Because this is a standard plastic model kit, expect to see the traditional plastic model kit assembly tools. Things like a pair of clean cut snips, as well as an X-Acto knife of some flavor. I use this small little box cutter that has the extendable blade, as well as these small little replaceable, or I should say breakable blade points, so when one gets dull, you snip it off and now you have a fresh blade ready to go. Other things that'll come in handy for the build is some sandpaper. You want to do something with a medium to a fine grit, like 150 to 220 should be really good for something like this, as well as also a set of needle files. Pretty much all the tools, by the way, that I'm showcasing are available to be found on places like Amazon.com, and in fact, for the snips and for the needle files, that's exactly where I procured them from. Obviously, some glue is going to be needed as well. Now, for all of my plastic model kit builds, as well as even my larger scale builds, I use the same thick CA that I have here. A lot of other people out there, they like to use some kind of a plastic cement or plastic adhesive in order to assemble their models. Me personally, I just enjoy working with super glue, and it works for me. One thing I do want to stress, though, is that you want to avoid at all costs using the old school Testors red tube model glue. That material, it's really on the lower end, and it's something that doesn't hold up very well in many ways. It's too clunky, it stinks, you'll end up killing brain cells when you're using it, and on top of that, the worst thing about it is you don't have any control over the flow, so you have a tendency of adding too much glue onto a part, and then to add insult to injury, the glue doesn't age well, so after a few years or so, the model actually starts falling apart on you, which it's something that's definitely less than ideal. Avoid that crap at all costs, and sadly, that glue is something that my father still uses on his build, so, you know, old boomer habits die hard, I suppose. Anyway, in addition to just the basic tools that I just mentioned here, something else I'm going to be utilizing is a Dremel with a drill bit and also a high-speed removal bit. These are going to come in handy when it comes time for me to modify the axle for the sprocket so that I could modify it and mount it on in that reverse manner that I mentioned before. Okay, now when it comes time for the actual assembly, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to skip over all of the instructions that pertain to the assembly and installation of the road wheels. The first thing I am going to start with, however, is going to be the sprocket, because I need to have this fully assembled in order for me to get a good idea on how much material needs to be removed off of the lower hull that I have here. So let's cut across to when the sprocket is assembled, and I'm going to go forth and modify the lower hull. Here I have one of the sprockets together, and this is actually one of the few areas to watch out for on one of these builds. You see, with the way the sprockets are molded, there's something that you have to remove in order to get the shape refined to the way you see it here. With the way the kit is molded, you have the sprocket and the piece is connected to the runner via these two sections. And by the way, this is true for both sprocket halves. With the way the sprocket is integrally molded onto the sprue, you have these two little tabs that descend from the sprue and enter onto the surface here of the sprocket. This technique I've seen utilized in several other kits that I've built over the years, and it's done mainly just for strength as well as for ease of molding. With this setup, the piece is rigid to the runner and the plastic can flow on in and properly mold the component. With the way this is done, the tooth itself is left intact because the piece sits above it. Now, this does need to be removed by the builder, and this is something that may be a hurdle to some more novice builders, but it's something that is easily taken care of. To make matters even easier, because this unit here has no other surface detailing on it like fasteners or other types of bolt detailing that's typically found on other kits, removing of these two nubs here is very easily done. To deburr these two little pegs, this is best done with a needle file like I have here. The way I like to do it is I first remove the two sections here of the side of the triangle, just to get the shape of the tooth. Once I have the shape that I'm happy with, it is at that point then where I can remove the bulk of it. It's kind of hard to get into focus with the way I have the camera set up right now, but it's actually pretty easily done. And it's also hard to get in frame without just blocking the view with my knuckles, but hopefully I could be able to muscle through. Okay, so now you get to see the point is back. So from here, I'm just going to go up and down here. And then just polish away the remainder of the material. And there we have it. There may be a little bit of hay left over from the filing procedure, but just a little bit more refinement with the X-Acto, and you'll be able to get the tooth sprocket ring refined to a very good degree. Once the sprockets are assembled, it's now time to fit them to the hull, or I should say make the modifications in order so that I could secure them to the hull. With the way the kit is designed, of course, this part here with the inset slides on here, and then a peg would then secure it in place. Well, like I stated before, it's going to look better if I flip it around because this better replicates the sprocket found on the real M26 Pershing. However, in order to do that, obviously I can't just mount it on this way because it's going to stick out far too much. So I'm going to need to shorten this peg here so that when I mount it on in the reverse way, it's still going to have the exact same outward appearance as it would originally if built out of the box. The way I'm going to do this is, well, I'm first going to take the sprocket and I'm going to mount it on in the kit original way. This is going to give me the spacing that's found on the stem here so that I know exactly how far the sprocket needs to protrude from the hull in order to line up properly with the remainder of the suspension. With a pencil, I'm going to go ahead and mark the location right here. And with that line now added, you'll see exactly how much material I need to cut away in order to secure the piece to the model in reverse. Now, one thing you have to factor in is the small little recess that we have here found on the stock sprocket. It's about a 1/16 of an inch or possibly a millimeter or two of thickness, or I should say of depth. And so when it comes time for removing of the material, I'm going to factor that in by adding just a small little line right here that visually looks very similar to the depth found on the stock sprocket. When it comes time for the removal process, I'm going to start with this new line and then just test fit the piece on until I get the appropriate width that I'm looking for. Once the indentations are marked, it's now time to remove this material, and this is where the Dremel comes in. Note I have the high-speed removal bit on this. Technically, it would be better to use a cut-off disc for the same procedure, but since I'm already committed at this point, I'll show that even with this bit here, you can still perform the task. Well, as you were able to see when I was cutting the piece with the Dremel, I was able to cut this in a nice straight line, which is exactly what you want, because if the piece is in an angle of any way, shape, or form, this is going to affect how the sprocket fits onto the shaft. So the goal is you want to have it as straight as possible. However, even with the material removed, I just refined it slightly further with a few more passes of the needle file. Here you can see the line that I drew before. And now I'm just going to test fit the part on, and you'll see that it lines up perfectly with the line as it did when it was mounted in the other configuration. If I try the same technique to this side, as you can see I have a little bit more material to remove, and this is going to be done by hand with the needle file. With the stem shortened, I'm going to go ahead and test fit the piece now with the upper and lower hulls temporarily connected to each other. Luckily, with the way the kit is designed, it plugs together pretty easily. With the pieces together, I'm just going to dry fit to see if they fit into the area over here, which is something to keep in mind because, like I said, these are going to be installed at the end of the build when the model is fully built, painted, and weathered. And as you can see, the piece just drops directly in place. Let's do a dry run with it with the track hooked up to the sprocket. And by the way, when it comes time for mounting the track, you're going to see that this is exactly how I have to do it, because I need to basically sneak this component in as one assembly in order to make the clearance from the side skirts. So and there we go. If this was time for final assembly, I take that center spindle and just mount it directly in place where it needs to go, and then I could assemble the remainder of the suspension. Now the last thing I need to do before I could call this modification complete is I need to drill a hole into both sides of the axle stem. The reason for this is because, like I said before, there is a pin that secures this sprocket to the vehicle, and this needs to slide into this portion over here. Now, if you're building the model out of the box, you do not have to worry about this. With the way the kit is designed, the stem should just be able to plug directly in place without any other modifications. But because I shortened the stems, this is going to require the mounting pin to sit in further than it was originally designed. So I'm going to have to allow this clearance by drilling out the small hole in the center. To do this, I'm going to mount this 3/32 drill bit on the Dremel, and I'm just going to go ahead and just drill these two sections out. This could also be done with a pin vise in case a Dremel is not on hand, but obviously if you don't have the Dremel on hand, you're not going to really be able to do the trimming procedure like I just showcased. Well, after the holes are drilled, it's then time to assemble the model. I'm just going to basically start with the external features, which will include the assembly of the upper and lower hull, the turret, as well as the majority of the surface details that are found on the top. At this point here, the build actually picks up its pace. Well, about a minute or two later, I have the hull fully assembled. The hull consists of the lower, the upper, and the rear plate. All three pieces go together very easily. The format is basically you first attach the upper to the lower, and then the rear plate just drops directly into place. If you use just the right amount of glues, you're not going to have too much seepage going on when it comes time for the pieces sliding in where they need to go. The one thing I want to point out is where the upper portion meets the lower. There is always a small little gap found in this little area here, and this is true for not just this one, but I've also seen it on both the Dragon and even the Tamiya M26 Pershing kits that I've built in the past. And to remove this small little seam here, it's done the exact same way. You basically take a little drop of glue, and you just smear it onto the two places where they meet, like so. And then you just smear it in with your finger. The gaps on these areas are so small that the need for any sort of red putty or glazing putty is not necessary. And just basically, you can achieve the exact same effect with just a little quick smear of glue. I'm going to let the glue set, and after that I'm just going to polish it down with the sandpaper, which should fuse everything in place. On the rear plate over here, the fit is so well that the need to add any sort of glue to remove any gaps is just not necessary. At this point now, I'm going to set the hull aside to allow the adhesives to fully set. And this now brings my attention to the turret. The turret is divided into 3 pieces. We have the lower portion, the upper portion, as well as the trunnion, and this component here needs to be mounted and sandwiched into these 2 portions here during assembly so that the gun can go up and down. Both the trunnion and the upper portion remove off the sprue very easily and deburr equally as easily. The lower portion also removes off of the sprue pretty quickly, but just like with the sprocket, you are going to have these 2 little tabs that are molded onto the surface here, and these need to be thoroughly removed, or else the upper and lower halves will not fit together. Now, I know that this information sounds like a no-brainer to most people out there, but this information here is really more or less geared to people who are beginners and who are stumbling into this video for the first time. So, with that in mind, the components are going to be removed. You could either just snip them away with your clean-cut snips as such, and that does a pretty decent job, or you can just file and polish them away with the needle file like I showcased before with the sprocket. With the way the turret pegs are designed, they assemble in such a tight, snug manner that the need for any extra rubber bands or tape to use to hold the turret in place while the glue set are just not necessary. However, just like with the front portion, if you notice there is a small little edge found on where these 2 halves do meet. And just like with the hull, we're going to take care of it in the exact same manner. I'm just going to inject some glue into these areas. And from here, I'm just going to set the turret aside like with the hull and let it fully set and dry. Once the glue is fully set, I can then go ahead and then just polish away the seams with a little bit of sandpaper. With the hull and the turret bodywork now wrapped up, you'll see that the seam work has been completely blended in without any other type of complications. Same is also true for the turret. And at this point here, I'm ready to continue with the remainder of the kit's assembly. Basically, at this point here, I could just assemble the model out of the box with the exception of the following components. Parts like the ammo cans, which get mounted to the sides, the jerry can that gets mounted to the rear, as well as the other small Pioneer tools are going to be omitted from the build at this time. Those components, I always found it easier to paint separately on the runner and then install them after the model is fully painted and weathered at the very tail end of the build. Just like what I was saying before with the wheels, I also do the same procedure with the tools. One tool that I forgot to mention earlier that can be of use on a kit like this is a small set of pliers. With a tool like this can help with the mounting of some of these smaller components when sometimes you just need that little extra oomph to get the part into its proper location. The plier can be of very good use for that. It's not a tool that you necessarily need to have for one of these builds, but it does help in many circumstances. One other thing that I also noticed on doing several of these builds in the past is that the tolerances on some of these components are on the snug side, and if it comes to the point where the piece is just not going in place, a trick that you can use is with the needle file is to just file away some of the material that's found here on the stems that emerge from the part. After maybe 1 or 2 passes, this should open up the tolerances where the part can slide into its proper location with a lot less effort. And this is important because some of these components here can be on the fragile side and you can accidentally break it by exhibiting too much force. Well, after about 5 minutes of actual work, the model is, at this point now, basically ready for painting. One thing I want to do, though, before I get it ready for painting, is I need to mount the mantlet onto the rotor drum. The reason why I haven't yet was because I had to allow the glue to set on these 2 sections over here. With the way the kit is designed, you have these 2 rotor sections, and they get glued to the front portion of the turret. Because of the way the top portion design, you have this lip that pops out, and when the two pieces connect, it forms one piece. However, you do have two seams that run along those two sections over there where the three pieces interconnect with each other. This was simply removed with the same bodywork method that I used on the hull as well as on the turret, with some CA added to these sections here. Once the super glue set, I polished it down with some sandpaper, leaving for a nice seamless appearance like we have here. While on the topic of bodywork, for the barrel is molded as a one solid piece, and it's slide molded so that the baffles and the muzzle section is molded hollow, which is a nice feature. However, one thing to point out with the way these barrels are molded, and this is true for not just this kit, but most models out there that have the same type of format, is you do have a small little mold line running along the center of the two portions, and this is, again, quite customary for things molded in this manner. This is very easily removed with just some very fine sandpaper like I have over here. Just go up and down these sections evenly, and after one or two swipes, the seam line is completely blended and flushed away. Which will now allow me to glue the mantlet to the rotor drum at this time. So with 2 small drops of glue, the piece should just line right up and click directly into place. With that last component installed, at this point here, the model is now ready for painting. Just before I go ahead and get it into paint though, I just want to go over some of the smaller tweaks that I made to it. First and foremost, on the spare pintle here, which on the real M26 is where the 50 caliber machine gun would be stowed when not mounted to the main pintle mount, which is found on top of the turret. The kit supply part is, you know, fairly decent in size, gives you again the shape and the idea of what the component is, but it's molded solid. Well, with a small Dremel bit, I just went ahead and drilled that out, giving it for the detail that you see here. On the hull itself, the one thing that I did run into is with these small little handles that are found on these corners of the fender work, the tolerances on these components are very, very, very tight. So tight, in fact, if you just try to muscle it in with a plier or even by hand, the only thing you're going to succeed in doing is breaking the little handle. So for this here, I recommend drilling the component out with a pin vise with a small Dremel bit, like the one that I have right here. For the best results, the bit size that I use is the .0370 Dremel bit. The link on where I purchased these bits is listed below in the video description. Just a few passes with these on these holes here remove just a slight bit of material, which will then allow the handles to drop in place without causing any problems. Some other areas to watch out for are some of these lift rings, and this is true for the turret as well. They are a bit on the snug side, like I mentioned previously. So again, a few swipes here and there with the needle file will open these tolerances up, and the parts will then just slide right into place. On this little bracket here on the back of the turret was one that really probably was the most egregious offender when it came to fitting of the parts. The stem is so tight that honestly I don't know how you would be able to install the piece on without removing any sort of material on either the slot or the piece itself. In fact, to get the piece on, I actually had to carve away some sections of the tab just so that it could fit in the location that you see here. So this is something you do have to keep in mind if you're working on one of these Meng Pershings. And then the last thing to mention is on the bow machine gun that we have here. The piece does pivot as per the kit, and as what's commonly seen on these models here, the machine gun end section is just molded flat and with a pin vise and with a very small bit, smaller than the last one that I use, which is, by the way, for reference, a .0250 diameter bit. By the way, same place where I mentioned before you can find these two. I went ahead and added the small hole found on the muzzle section, again done with a pin vise. Honestly, this is a technique that if you don't have the tools or even the skill with working with something like this, just avoid it. The only thing you're going to do is screw it up, and it's just going to make for a broken part. So if you don't have the experience, best to just leave it stock out of the box. Of course, with the main assembly out of the way, it now brings us to painting. For the painting, the model has already been pre-primed off screen. Like I mentioned in several of my videos, for the paint to stick to the model, it's best to have some kind of coat of paint already on the surface. Some people use a fancy type of primer or a dedicated plastic model primer of one flavor or another. Me, I'm a little bit on the cheaper end, and I just use, well, just a regular can of El Cheapo flat black spray paint. Before I could go ahead and prime and paint the model, of course there's a little bit of prep work, and this is done off camera. Basically what I do is I stuff paper into the hatch areas on the model, and I like to suspend my components on a wire. The wire does a couple benefits. First, it allows you full access to get to all the locations on the model with the paint, and this will prevent any locations where you might miss a spot due to the way you're holding it. Another benefit that this has is with drying. Once you paint the component, you can just simply hang it up on a clothesline or a rack of some sort or another, and this will have zero contact with anything that's wet. If you're painting parts, a lot of times, you might paint it, you might set it down. Well, guess what? Now that location where you applied the paint is now making contact with the floor of one sort, and it can add to some complications. By suspending it, this reduces that immensely. For the turret over here, you'll notice that I ran the wire through the gun muzzle. This is another thing I want to point out. If you're going to go with the suspension technique, it's a great technique, but you have to be careful what you're suspending it from. If you're going to put it on a small piece of detailing like this, you're going to be asking for some trouble, and that's something you don't want to do. When you're suspending a model, you want to anchor down to a component that is very strong and is very sturdy to prevent any sort of screw-ups happening, like something stupid, like for instance the glue's giving way and the piece popping off or possibly breaking on you when the component's swinging around due to the painting or just with general handling. The muzzle brake over here, it's a very strong point. It's nice thick with its moldings, and the way it's attached to the model, it's not going to crack off in any way. So that's a perfect location to hang something like a turret. For the hull, one of the best locations to do it is from one of these holes over here, which are used to secure the wheels in place. However, on the model, as we recall, these holes here, or I should say these sections, are actually solid and don't go into the hull. Off screen, I went ahead and took a drill bit and I drilled out these locations on either side, which will allow me to run the wire directly through, and obviously something like this will never break off on you. So this gives a very strong sturdy point in order to add the paint. For the actual application, I'm using my Pershing double action airbrush. I've utilized this airbrush on a number of videos, and basically I've been using the exact same airbrush now since 2002. So it's got a lot of mileage on it, but if you properly maintain it, the thing will last you forever. The air compressor is my larger 30-gallon unit. I've mentioned it in a few other videos, and in case you haven't seen it, I would recommend watching those other rebuild videos that I go into more depth on your air compressor choice and why that's actually very important. But there's no real point in beating a dead horse. If you are interested in that, however, I would seriously recommend watching one or a few of those videos to get a good idea on why that's the case. So from here, I'm just going to go ahead and mask up, power on the air compressor, and start applying the paint. Well, with the base coat added and fully set now, you can see that the model's really starting to take shape. This took 2 coats of the base in order to get it to the position that we see it here. And now that's fully dried, is at this point where I could go ahead and apply the camouflage. The camouflage are going to be the black stripes that are typically seen on late pattern of World War II vehicles. And it's the same type of paint job that I incorporated on the last Meng World War Toons Pershing build that I did about a year ago. The Paint itself, it's in the paint cup, and it's just Tamiya flat black. Add a couple drops of water to it just to slightly dilute it. But from here, I'm going to go ahead now and apply the camo. And as you can see, the airbrush does the camo pattern in a really short period of time. With the pattern now out of the way, is at this point where I can start the weathering. For the weathering, I have several different techniques, but the one that I use on the last M26 is going to be the same one I'm going to use on this one because, well, that's exactly what the customer wants. So, this one, I just used some watered down, just flat white paint over here, and I just airbrush into certain key locations, which will give you a faded effect. The white itself, just exterior latex, flat white, stuff you find in any home improvement store. And I just diluted it to the point that you see here. In fact, I'm going to add a little bit more water because it looks like it's dried up a little bit since the last time I used it. When it comes to this type of a weathering format, I like to go as watered down really as you possibly can. Of course, you don't want to have it too much because then it's just going to cause some problems, but the more watered down this is, the less opacity you're going to have, which will then give you some different results and different types of effects. So as for what works for you, well, you know, basically just trial and error, play around with it and see what, you know, what type of techniques you like and which ones you can alter a little bit to make them more your own. So I poured a little bit of paint into the cup. I'm going to power up my air compressor. And now I'm just going to go ahead and apply the misting. And after a few toots, you'll see how the model starts transforming right in front of your eyes. See how much more faded the hull looks compared to the turret. With the fade now added, the next thing I like to do is I like to add a bit of contrast. And the one way I do that is by going over some of the edges with a darker shade of one color or another. You could use black, you could use a darker green, but depending on what's the look you're going after, you can change out the colors a little bit. Now for this one here, I'm going to be going with a darker green type coloring. This color, it's the color that I use on many of my other builds. I typically use it on more 1950s era vehicles, and it's actually my own mix. So a color that's very similar to this would be like Tamiya olive drab, something along those lines. As long as you have a nice rich olive color like this one here, you should get basically the same result. The trick is, just like with the white, is to have something that's nice and diluted so it's not overpowering when it gets added, but you could definitely tell that there's something going on over there. So I'm going to turn on the air compressor now and continue with the weathering job. And you can see now with the addition of that green coloring how much the model has already progressed even from a couple steps earlier. The next step I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to highlight a lot of little nooks and crevices that are found on this model here. And I'm going to be using a technique that is a little bit different compared to what I used before, because this is one that I've been playing around with since the other build, and that's with using Tamiya panel line accent. The stuff is basically, it's a turpentine based black that's heavily diluted, and it just runs in place. In the past I've used techniques similar to this with taking acrylic paint, adding a lot of alcohol to it to get a similar effect. It's basically the same type of procedure. The thing I want to point out is that if you paint your model with enamel, specifically, like if you're a guy that likes to use the Model Master enamels, you want to stay away from this stuff because this will dissolve the paint that's already on the model because it's, again, paint thinner based. So with that in mind, on a model like this that's painted with latex and acrylics, it shouldn't have any problem. Now, a lot of people are going to be saying, but John, you spray painted the bottom flat black. Is this going to interfere with it? The answer is no, because, again, of the other layers of paint that I have built on top. After the accent paint is added, the next step is to weather the remainder of the edges, giving that worn look, which is generally seen on my builds. For this, I'm going to use the dry brushing method, and I'm going to be using flat black in order to achieve this look. Now, the technique itself I've mentioned in more depth in another tutorial video. Actually, was when I built a 1/6 scale M1919 machine gun. Check that video out in order to get a good idea on basically the same techniques that you're going to be seeing here. So, the paint I'm going to be using is just a can of flat black Rust-Oleum. This is an enamel-based paint, so turpentine is going to be used to clean out the brushes as well as to do other things with it. So, once the paint is mixed, a couple dabs on the lid over here, and then once I rub most of the paint off, I can then start with the dry brushing process. By the way, if you notice, I like to start on the bottom of my models because I get a good idea on the feel that the brush is giving me, and it's on a location that's not visible. So if I have a mistake or something, I can clean it up without causing any problems throughout the remainder of the model's paintwork. At some point, the paint on the bristles are going to dry up, and that happens, just repeat the process. There's also going to be a point when the bristles become so gunked up that I'm just not happy with the flow that I'm getting with the paint. And then when that happens, I just wash the brush out with some turpentine or paint thinner, and it will soften up the brush and then allow me to continue where I was before. And that's basically how I do it. Alright, so with the hull done, we'll switch over to the turret and wrap that one up too. Well, there we have it. At this point here, the weathering is basically completed. There are one or two things I'm going to still add to wrap up the weathering, but these will be done after the model gets its coat of varnish. At this point here, the model can get its markings, where I go ahead and add the water slide decals that are supplied with the model, and then the model can progress further. At this point here, however, while I'm going to be doing the markings, I can also go ahead and paint the tracks, because obviously these got to be painted now, because once these are painted, then I can go ahead and start assembling the wheels and getting them fitted to the model. For painting of the tracks themselves, this is going to be done with the airbrush via Tamiya Flat Black. Like I've stated in a few other videos, you don't want to use spray paint in order to paint single-piece vinyl tracks because depending on the paints you use, it can harm the material that the tracks are made in. So, and since these companies keep changing their formulas every number of years, the best way to avoid any sort of complications with your tracks is to just paint them with the Tamiya. So far, I've had models age very well with the Tamiya paint, and I haven't seen any issues with the tracks brittling up or dry rotting on me. So, I recommend just using this just as a rule of thumb if you have single-piece vinyl tracks. Not just true for this kit, but again, all plastic 1/35 scale tank kits out there that give you this type of track feature. For the actual paintwork, I'm not going to show it on screen, as there's really no point. It's just I'm going to be airbrushing these tracks with the flat black. Jumping ahead to the model's markings, all of the kit supply decals have been added. And just like I said in the other World War Toons videos, the Meng decals are made with current state-of-the-art decal printing technology, and because of that, the decals are very good in their quality. At this point, however, you'll notice that the decals have just been applied raw. There's no other additive or lacquers that have been applied to the surface in order to secure them in place. The only thing that's keeping them on the surface right now is the hydrogen bonds that were found when the units were slid off their decal paper and slid onto the model surface. From this point here, I'm going to go ahead and add a varnish to the entire surface of the model in order to secure and anchor on the decals, preventing them from blowing off or getting damaged, because that is a problem with water-slide decals, by the way. If they're untreated in any way, they can easily, or they're very susceptible to falling off or moving on you, as well as also that dreaded decal shine that we have here just from the ambient light. So when the varnish gets applied, this is going to mitigate a lot of the sheen, and it's also going to go ahead and prevent the decals from being damaged from just basic handling. For this sealant, I'm going to be utilizing this varnish here from VMS. If anyone have watched the last few videos I've done within the past few months, you'll notice I've been mentioning this material quite a bit, and there's actually some pretty good reason to that, and that's because this stuff is absolutely awesome. I've fallen in love with it basically after the first time I used it, and for me, there's no looking back. This completely obliterates the last substance I was using out of the water, and I cannot recommend this stuff enough. The website to purchase this is listed in the video description below, and again, give them some business because they came up with a really good product. To apply the varnish, this is done via an airbrush, and if anyone is observant, you'll notice that this is not the same airbrush I'd use for the remainder of the paintwork. This airbrush here, I have solely dedicated just for the varnish, and I do this just to prevent any sort of cross-contamination with the various paints that I use. However, if you do not have access to a second airbrush, this stuff here is made from acrylic, and because it's acrylic based, cleaning out the airbrush is very simple. You use water and or alcohol, and the stuff cleans up very quickly and easily. To start, the first thing I did was I thoroughly shook the contents in the bottle here for about 30 seconds. This is done to make sure that the material is thoroughly mixed so that it gives you the best results when it's applied to the model's finish. I'm also going to go ahead and put on my respirator because I really don't want to get this stuff in my lungs. And with the respirator on now, I'm going to go ahead and turn on the air compressor as well as get this thing ready to go. No other thinners need to be added. You just use it straight from the bottle and you're good to go. You apply the varnish in this type of format, make sure that the model looks nice and wet. And at this point here, you can set it aside and let it dry. And that's basically it. I'm now going to set this aside and let the material set fully. With the hull and the turret set aside to allow the varnish to fully set and dry, it's now time to focus on the tracks, getting them ready for installation. The tracks have already been painted with their Tamiya flat black. This one here has been completed, so you get to see exactly what it's going to look like when it's done. On the interior portion here, I painted with Tamiya rubber black, which is XF85. It's a slightly different shade, which will give you a little bit of contrast compared to the two colors. From this point here, I'm now ready to go ahead and add the weathering to the surface, which is done via dry brush. And if anyone has seen my M1919 video, you'll know exactly the procedure I'm going to use, which is silver spray paint and a fan brush. I'm just going to go ahead and dry brush it on, similar to the technique that I did before with the flat black. As many of us know, on the real Pershing track, the interior portion would be rubber, so I'm not going to go and add any steel to those locations. And by the way, that's why I painted it with the rubber black color that I mentioned before. Because of the small size, these tracks weather very quickly, and also because they are molded in one single piece, I'm not going to have to worry about joining the two halves together, as you would on other type of 1/35 scale models. That's all there is to it. From this point here, I'm just going to let the tracks fully sit and dry, and when I cut across back to the tank, you're going to see me install the wheels as well as these tracks. Once the varnish and the tracks are ready to go, it's now time to get the model into its final assembly. The wheels have been assembled at this point, and you'll notice I also went ahead and painted the rubber tires with the same rubber black that I used on the inside portion here of the track. At this point here, we can now fit on the tracks as well as the remainder of the suspension. Now, like I stated before, because I went ahead and pre-assembled the upper and lower hulls together, getting the track and the sprockets, not to mention the running gear, into their locations is going to be a little bit trickier compared to the kit original, where they want you to pre-assemble all these components prior to assembling the upper and lower hull halves together. And here's the suspension now fitted to one of the sides. Now I am going to walk you guys over with the installation process on the opposite side here, so you get to see exactly how to pull this off when the upper and lower hulls are mounted together. If you'll notice, there are no components found on this portion over here, not even the return rollers. You see, you need this empty space over here in order to get the track to slide in place, and then you need the room to squeeze in the sprocket and the front idler. The components are going to be using the kit supply parts, and this is basically going to be used out of the box. Where the trick comes in is with the sequence on which the parts go together. First thing I'm going to do is I'm actually going to start with the sprocket. Now the sprocket peg and the row wheel pegs are different from each other, so you have to pay attention to this when you're building one of these models. The peg for the rollers has this big cone section that we have here on the top, while the one for the sprocket just has this rounded off nub. In addition to removing and cleaning off that little extra bit of sprue that's on this part here, I'm also going to take the X-Acto and just run it up along the surface just to scrape away any paint layers that have been built up on these two components. By removing the layers of paint, this will open up the tolerances and will make the mounting of the parts a little bit easier. And the part can slide into place without there being any interference from the thing binding up from extra gunked up layers of paint. To test it, I'm just going to slide it in, and as you can see, the piece drops directly in place where it needs to be. Once the peg is able to be slid into the sprocket, I'm going to temporarily leave it in this position, like the way you see it here. You see, when it comes time for inserting the peg into place, it's going to be a little tricky to work around this portion here of the fender, so by having the peg in the sprocket, this allows you to then just push the component in without having to muscle it in and trying to align everything by hand. At this point now, we are ready to install the track. The track just squeezes directly into place by popping it over the areas where the return rollers will go, sliding it into this portion here of the fender, as well as this portion here of the rear tin work. At this point, you also want to pay attention to the orientation of the tracks. Make sure that the thread direction is going in the appropriate manner. Otherwise, it's really going to hurt the look of your build. Once the track is in place, with the bottle glue, I'm going to add a small drop of glue right here to the inside portion of the mounting hole for the peg. You want to be careful with this because you don't want to use too much glue where it can seize up and cause some issues, but you don't want to use too little where it's just not going to hold the piece in. Luckily, these pieces here hold on pretty well, so just a little dab will do you. Hopefully this comes out on camera. Yeah, and that's really all there is to it. So now I'm just going to take the sprocket, make sure that the peg isn't dangling in right now. Just have it sticking out like the way I have it right here. So now I could just go ahead and get this into place. May take a couple attempts. You just basically have to find that little sweet spot. What I'm doing is I'm looking into this section over here and see where the section comes out of the hull as well as the back portion of the sprocket, and you just have to basically line it up. It's one of those things where it's easier to do in person than it is to do it on camera, but once you have it in, the piece will just lock directly in place. Once the piece is lined up, you then just take some kind of an implement and you just push the pin in until it fully seats. After the sprocket, it's now time to do the front idler. And I use the exact same procedure. I clip off the peg, I scrape off the paint, and get it ready for installation. Also, you want to pay attention to what parts are the main bogey wheels and what parts are the front roller. You'll notice that the front idler wheel is slightly smaller compared to the main bogey wheel, so that's something you want to pay attention to because you can easily screw that up. For the glue, it's going to be using the exact same procedure. Just a little bit dead center into the hole is all you need. And then I'm just going to line this fella up. Once you find that sweet spot, the peg just drops directly in place. And at this point here, you're ready to mount on the rollers and the main bogies. I like to start with the rollers first and then handle the bogies when the rollers are already fitted. The rollers just pressure fit directly on. Of course, a little drop of glue is added just to make sure everything stays where it needs to be. With the rollers on, it's now time to do the main bogey wheels. And again, it's the exact same process that I mentioned before for both the sprocket and the idler. Remove the peg, possibly remove the built-up layers of paint, add the drop of glue, and slide it in place. And there we have it. The front and rear bogey wheels are a little bit trickier to install because you have the track tension to contend with, but the track easily just bends out of the way and allows the wheel to lock in place and for that peg to enter in. Once the wheels are on, the track is movable, as you can see, as are the wheels. Obviously the rollers are not, but the main suspension can rotate. However, like I frequently mention, you don't want to play with this thing a lot because the paint will start chipping off on them and it'll eventually just hurt the look of the model. So it's one thing to keep in mind on basically every plastic model kit out there. Well, with the suspension out of the way, the remainder of the build can commence. Right here, these are the ammo cans. If you notice, I've painted them off camera with a darker shade of olive drab, and these are just going to be mounted in their appropriate locations. The tools have also been painted, and their metal components have been weathered. Only thing that remains on them is I'm going to paint the tool handles. Once they dry, they too will be dropped directly in their corresponding locations. After the last of the remaining components get added, the model at this point here is about 98% complete. There are about 3 things that remain to be done in order to cross this one off of the to-do list, and I'm actually going to go ahead and get it on video because it's just some loose ends I want to tie up. The first bit of detailing is the MP48 spring antenna base. This is something that more often than not people forget or don't know how to paint, and it's something that is super easy to do, and it's one that doesn't really require all that much work, but yet also yields a lot of really nice results. Although this is a cartoonish build, the importance of the MP48 is equally significant on this model as it is on something that's a little bit more serious, like a Tamiya, Hobby Boss, Dragon, or, so on and so forth. The MP48 is really simple to decipher. You would have the bottom portion right here, a spring, and then the top cylinder. The most important portion is the section between this cylinder and this top portion here where the wire would plug into. This little gap right in there, that's the portion where most people tend to ignore or not even know about on this little bit of a component. On the real unit, this center portion here is actually made from porcelain, and it's very easy to find because they have these 3 distinctive ridges that are found on them. In order to paint MP48s, the best color to use is Tamiya Hull Red XF9. Just shake the bottle up a little bit. And then with a very fine point paintbrush, I'm just going to go ahead and paint the recesses that you see here. Just a little swipe is really all you need to highlight this little component. And that's it. From here, I'm going to let the paint fully dry, and then I'm going to go ahead and add something else to it to really make it pop. Once the hull red is fully dry, the next thing I'd like to do is add a little swipe of gloss lacquer to these sections. You see, the real unit, because it is ceramic, it does have a glaze on it, and that glaze has a nice glossy look to it. The Tamiya hull red, in contrast, is a flat coloring, so if you only paint it with that color, you're really partway there. In order to make it shine, like I said before, I'm using a gloss lacquer, and I'm using Tamiya Clear X22. Just make sure it's nice and mixed. And I just go over the exact same locations that I did before with the hull red, but this time just with the gloss. Make sure there's not too much on there where it can cause a problem. You just want to get it on the red sections, no more and no less. That's literally all you need to do to make your 1/35 scale or larger American tanks pop. By the way, the exact same procedures can also be done to the MP65 and the MP37 antenna bases. All of these are found on various 1/35 scale model kits that are on the market. The next thing I need to do is I need to blend in the markings now with the remainder of the weathering. Like I showcased before, the markings were added after the model's dry brushing was added, and because of which you do have some continuity issues where you see the part over here where it's heavily weathered, but the marking is left completely intact. Well, now that the markings have been added and varnished on, I'm not going to have to worry about them getting damaged or any other type of issues with the paints making contact with the surface, so I can add the dry brushing to them in the same technique that I did before, with the same brush no less. With the dry brushing added, the decals now blend in much better compared to before. And at this point now, the last thing that needs to be done before I could put the done stamp on this one is to add a bit of powder fouling to both the main gun, the coax machine gun, and of course, last but not least, a bit of soot here on the exhaust manifold. This is done with the airbrush. I have some Tamiya flat black ready to go. I'm going to power on the compressor and go ahead and add the last of the weathering. And now that the model's fully completed, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around. Like I stated earlier in the video, one of the requirements that the customer had was that they wanted the model to look as close as possible to the other M26 Pershing that I built for my own collection about a year ago. Well, in order to prove that, and also to prove this is the same model, here you can see right next to it my other World War Toons M26 Pershing. This is the vehicle that is found on the other model showcase video that's found on the ECA channel. And if you look at the two together, I think it's suffice to say that the models are almost identical to each other. From here, the model is going to be carefully bubble wrapped along with the other build that I built for the same commissioner. They're going to be boxed up and sent off to the customer, who by the time this video drops should have the model and hopefully be very happy with it. Briefly going over skill level and recommendations, like I stated in the other videos for the same type of vehicle lineup, these World War Toons models are very easy to put together, and without a whole lot of elbow grease, you can polish them up into something that looks really, really interesting. Because of the subject matter, you have a lot of creative licensing with one of these kits here, and you can go as conservative as you want with the build, i.e. just building it straight out of the box, or you can go in the opposite direction and super detail and customize it to your heart's content. And to compound this, the vehicles themselves are very affordable when found and are very easily come by. These models have some wide distribution to them, so tracking one down isn't very difficult. Obviously, I would recommend this model for anyone who's a fan of the World War Toons video game series, or if you just like to have some interesting pieces in your Model 10 collection. If you're getting a little bored with building your standard super detail type plastic model kits, and are looking for something a little bit more fun, as well as something that's easy and quick to put together, these World War Toons tanks are a great addition to your collection. And with that, that wraps up this step-by-step build tutorial video for this caricaturized M26 Pershing medium tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being caricaturized tanks like this one here to your standard 1/35 scale and larger scale model showcase videos, and even project update videos. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that have been posted on this channel in the past. Furthermore, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks again, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. See ya.